What if the reason they keep walking away isn't actually because they can? What if deep down, every time they leave, something inside the connection quietly allowed it to happen? That might sound uncomfortable at first, maybe even a little frustrating, because it feels like they're the one with all the power, the one who pulls away, goes silent, disappears without explanation, and comes back whenever it suits them. It feels like you're the one left waiting, adjusting, trying to understand something that never fully makes sense. But here's the truth that changes everything. The dynamic isn't one-sided. It never was. The distance, the silence, the leaving, it doesn't exist in isolation. It exists inside a pattern. And that pattern has two sides. The part no one tells you is that avoidants don't just leave because they want to. They leave because something in the dynamic makes it easy for them to go without feeling like they've truly lost you. And once you see that clearly, something shifts. Because this isn't about controlling another person. It's about understanding the invisible space where your energy meets theirs and realizing that you've had more influence there than you ever thought. For a long time, it probably felt like they were the ones setting the tone. When they were close, everything felt right. When they pulled away, everything felt uncertain. You may have found yourself trying to read between the lines, analyzing every message, every delay, every change in tone. And slowly, without even noticing it, your emotional state started depending on their presence. When they leaned in, you felt secure. When they leaned out, you felt like something was slipping. That's how the illusion of control begins. It's not that they consciously decided to take power, it's that their distance created a reaction, and that reaction gave the impression that they were the ones leading everything. But here's what's really happening beneath the surface. Their behavior is driven by discomfort with closeness, not confidence in leaving. The moment things start to feel too real, too emotionally intense, something inside them pulls back. Not because they don't care, but because closeness feels overwhelming in a way they don't fully understand. And when they pull away, what happens next determines everything. Because if that space is immediately filled, if you reach out, reassure, try to fix, try to reconnect, then the pattern completes itself. They step back, and the connection stays intact without them having to face any real loss. That's the part that's hard to see when you're in it. It feels like you're just trying to hold on to something meaningful. It feels like you're protecting the connection. But from their perspective, it creates a kind of emotional safety net. They can step away, take space, even disappear for a while, and still feel like you'll be there when they return. Not because you said it directly, but because your actions made it clear. And this is where the real shift begins. Because the power in this dynamic doesn't come from forcing someone to stay. It comes from what happens when staying is no longer guaranteed. Avoidants don't respond to pressure the way you might expect. The more they feel chased, the more distance they need. But when something changes, when the energy they relied on is no longer there in the same way, it creates a kind of pause. A moment where they can't just move the same way they always have. And that's when things start to feel different. Most people never get to this point because they're focused on the surface. They focus on the words, the actions, the inconsistency. They try to solve it by doing more, being more understanding, more patient, more available. But the deeper layer of this dynamic isn't about doing more. It's about recognizing what your behavior is silently communicating. Every time you chase, you're not just expressing care. You're reinforcing the idea that the connection doesn't depend on their consistency. Every time you over-explain your feelings, you're not just being open, you're showing that you're willing to carry the emotional weight alone. And slowly, without realizing it, the balance shifts. Not because you're weak, not because you don't matter, but because the dynamic has adapted to a pattern where your effort fills the space their distance creates. But here's something most people don't realize. Avoidants don't actually feel secure in that pattern. It might look like they're comfortable being distant, but underneath that, there's a constant push and pull happening inside them. Part of them wants connection. Part of them fears it. So they move closer, then step back, then come back again. It's not random. It's not calculated. It's a cycle. And what keeps that cycle going isn't just their behavior, it's the response they receive when they pull away. Because if nothing changes on your side, then there's no reason for the pattern to change on theirs. They don't have to confront the possibility of losing you. They don't have to sit with the discomfort of absence. The connection stays open, even when they're not fully present in it. And this is where the idea of permission comes in, not in a literal sense, but in an emotional one. It's not about telling them they can leave. It's about what your energy communicates when they do. If your actions show that you'll always be there, no matter how inconsistent they are, then leaving doesn't feel like a real risk to them. It feels temporary, reversible, safe. But when that shifts, when your presence is no longer something they can assume will always be there in the same way, it changes how they experience distance. Suddenly, pulling away doesn't feel as comfortable because now there's uncertainty. Not in a manipulative way, not in a game-playing way, but in a real, grounded sense. The connection is no longer something they can step in and out of without consequence. And the moment that happens, something interesting begins to unfold. They start noticing the space. They start feeling the difference. Not because you told them anything directly, but because the pattern they were used to no longer works the same way. And that's when curiosity starts to replace certainty. That's when they begin to move toward you instead of away, not because they're being controlled, but because the dynamic itself has changed. The energy they were responding to is different now, and that forces them to respond differently too. This doesn't mean the situation suddenly becomes easy. It doesn't mean they instantly transform into someone who shows up perfectly, but it does mean that the invisible structure of the connection has shifted. You're no longer reacting in the same way. You're no longer filling every gap they create, and that alone changes how they experience you, because now your presence carries weight. It's not automatic. It's not guaranteed. It's something they have to actively move toward if they want to keep it. And maybe the most important part of all of this is understanding that this isn't about becoming someone else. It's not about playing hard to get or pretending not to care. It's about recognizing the role you've been playing in a pattern that was never fully serving you and deciding to step out of it. Not by force, not by manipulation, but by shifting your energy in a way that aligns with your own value. Because when you stop overextending, when you stop chasing, when you stop trying to hold everything together on your own, you create a space where the connection either balances itself or reveals what it truly is. And that's the moment where everything becomes clear. Because at that point, they're no longer leaving something that feels endlessly available, they're facing the possibility of losing something real. And whether they step forward or step away, it's no longer happening in the same dynamic as before. And when that shift happens, when your presence is no longer something they can quietly rely on without showing up for it, something inside them starts to wake up in a way that even they don't fully understand, because up until that point, the connection felt like something they could move in and out of without consequence. It felt stable even in its inconsistency. They could pull away when things got too close, take space when emotions felt overwhelming, and still return to something familiar when they were ready. But now, something is different. The space they used to create so easily no longer feels the same. It feels heavier. It feels uncertain. And that's where the real meaning of permission begins to unfold. It was never about words. It was never about saying you can leave or you can't leave. It was always about what your energy allowed them to feel when they did. Before, when they stepped back, the connection stayed emotionally open. It stayed accessible. It stayed safe for them even in their absence. But now, without you needing to say anything, that openness begins to close, not in a harsh or punishing way, but in a grounded, self-respecting way. You're no longer reaching to fill the silence. You're no longer trying to decode every shift in their behavior. And in that quiet change, something powerful happens. They no longer feel the same sense of control over the distance. Because distance only feels easy when it doesn't cost anything, and for the first time, it starts to feel like it might. That's when their behavior begins to shift, sometimes subtly, sometimes in ways that catch you off guard. They might reach out sooner than expected. They might test the waters with small messages, small gestures, small attempts to reconnect. It might not look dramatic at first. In fact, it might feel almost casual. But underneath that, there's something deeper happening. They're trying to understand the change. They're trying to feel where they stand now. Because the version of you they were used to, the one who would always meet them halfway, even when they stepped back, is no longer showing up in the same way. And this is where most people unknowingly undo everything. Because the moment they feel that shift, the moment they see even a small sign of the avoidant coming back, something inside them lights up again. Hope returns, relief washes in. And almost instinctively, they lean forward. They respond quickly. They open up. They try to rebuild the connection exactly where it left off. And in doing that, they recreate the same dynamic that allowed the distance in the first place. It's not a mistake you make because you're weak. It's a reaction you have because you care. But this is the moment where everything either changes or resets. Because what matters here isn't whether they come back. What matters is how you receive them when they do. If you meet them with the same level of emotional availability they're used to, especially after they've created distance, then nothing has really shifted in their experience. The connection still feels accessible without consistency. It still feels like something they can step away from and return to without earning their place back in it. But when your response is different, when it's calm, steady, and not driven by the fear of losing them, they feel that, not as rejection, not as punishment, but as a change in the emotional structure of the connection. You're still present. You're still open, but you're no longer overextending. And that creates something they're not used to navigating. Because avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional pressure, but they're also deeply affected by emotional absence. When the pressure is gone, but the availability isn't unlimited anymore, it puts them in a space where they actually have to engage differently. They can't just react. They have to choose. And that's where the deeper psychology of this dynamic starts to reveal itself. Avoidants don't pull away because they feel powerful. They pull away because something inside them feels overwhelmed. Closeness, vulnerability, emotional intensity, it activates a part of them that associates connection with discomfort, so their instinct is to create space. Not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to stay present in that level of emotional closeness for too long. And when they do create space, they're not thinking about losing you, they're thinking about regulating themselves. But if that space becomes too comfortable, if it never challenges them to step forward, then the pattern becomes permanent. That's why chasing always backfires, even when it feels like the most natural thing to do. Because chasing removes the very tension that would have brought them closer. It reassures them that they don't have to move toward the connection, because the connection is already moving toward them. And while that might create temporary closeness, it weakens the long-term dynamic. It keeps them in a position where they don't have to confront their own pattern. But when you stop chasing, not out of anger, not out of manipulation, but out of self-respect, you introduce something they can't ignore: space. Not the kind of space they create, but the kind they have to step into. And this is where emotional neutrality becomes one of the most powerful shifts you can make. Not coldness, not distance, but a calm, grounded presence that isn't trying to control the outcome. You're not reacting to every move they make, you're not trying to fix every moment of silence, you're simply existing in a way that doesn't revolve around their inconsistency. And that's unfamiliar to them. Because before, your energy may have felt predictable. They knew that if they pulled away, you would feel it, you would respond, you would try to bring things back together. But now there's a steadiness in you that doesn't fluctuate based on their behavior. And that steadiness creates a kind of emotional mirror they're not used to seeing. They start to feel their own distance more clearly. They start to notice the silence they created. They start to experience the connection from a different perspective, one where they're not being pulled back in but have to step forward on their own. And that's where boundaries quietly begin to take shape. Not loud, dramatic boundaries filled with ultimatums or demands, but subtle, consistent ones that show through your actions. You don't engage in conversations that feel one-sided. You don't overinvest when they're inconsistent. You don't make yourself endlessly available when they've been absent. And you don't do it with resentment. You do it with clarity. Because you're no longer trying to hold on to something at any cost. You're allowing it to either meet you where you are or fall away on its own. And that's the moment where the dynamic starts to turn. Because now, for the first time, they're not just experiencing connection, they're experiencing the possibility of losing it. Not in a dramatic, obvious way, but in a quiet, undeniable shift. And that changes everything. Because when someone who is used to having emotional space without consequence begins to feel that space closing, even slightly, it creates a kind of internal tension they can't easily ignore. They might not express it directly, they might not even fully understand it themselves, but it shows up in the way they start moving toward you again, in the way they become more present, more attentive, more engaged than before. Not perfectly, not consistently right away, but differently. And the difference matters. Because it's no longer coming from a place of reacting to your energy, it's coming from a place of responding to your absence. And that's where the real shift begins to take hold. Not because you controlled them, but because you stopped giving away the part of yourself that made it easy for them to leave without ever truly losing you. And once that shift begins, once they start feeling your absence in a way they didn't before, the connection enters a completely different phase. This is where most people think the hard part is over. They see the avoidant leaning back in, becoming more attentive, more responsive, sometimes even more emotionally present than they've ever been, and it feels like everything is finally falling into place. But this is actually the most delicate part of the entire dynamic, because what happens here determines whether the pattern truly changes or quietly resets back to what it was. Because as they start to feel you slipping, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that feels like rejection, but in a way that feels real, they begin to move closer. It might show up in small ways at first, more consistent messages, slightly deeper conversations, a subtle effort to stay connected instead of disappearing. And if you've been waiting for this moment, it can feel almost relieving, like something you've been holding your breath for is finally happening. But underneath that relief, there's a quiet test taking place. Not a test they're consciously setting, but a test built into the dynamic itself. They're trying to feel if the connection is still as accessible as it used to be. They're trying to understand if your shift is temporary or if something has genuinely changed. And the moment you respond in the same way you always have, quickly, fully, emotionally open in a way that immediately restores the old closeness, you answer that question for them. You show them that nothing has really changed. And just like that, the cycle begins to rebuild itself. This is the mistake almost everyone makes here, not because they don't understand what's happening, but because the emotional pull of the moment feels stronger than the awareness they've built. When someone who once felt distant suddenly moves closer, it triggers something deep, a sense of validation, a sense of being chosen, and without realizing it, you step forward to meet them with everything you held back before. But this is where your power either stabilizes or disappears. Because what matters here isn't whether you respond, it's how you respond. Instead of rushing back into the same emotional depth, there's a different way of being present, slower, more grounded, not reactive, but intentional. You're not ignoring them, you're not playing games, you're simply matching the pace of what they're offering instead of overextending beyond it. And that difference might seem small on the surface, but emotionally it changes everything. Because now, for the first time, they're experiencing a version of connection where they have to participate consistently to maintain it. You're not carrying the weight anymore. You're not filling the gaps anymore. You're allowing the connection to breathe, and in that space, they have to decide whether they're willing to step forward in a real way. And this is where silence becomes one of the most powerful forces in the entire dynamic. Not the kind of silence that comes from hurt or withdrawal, but the kind that comes from inner stability. The kind where you don't feel the need to respond immediately. The kind where you're not constantly checking for messages or overanalyzing every interaction. You're simply present in your own life, grounded in your own energy, and that creates a natural rhythm that doesn't revolve around them. And for someone who is used to emotional availability being constant, that silence speaks louder than anything you could say, because it forces them to feel something they've been able to avoid for a long time. The absence of reassurance, the absence of certainty, the absence of knowing exactly where they stand without having to invest. And that absence creates reflection. They begin to think about you more. They begin to wonder what you're feeling, what you're doing, whether the connection still holds the same place in your life. Not because you told them anything directly, but because your energy is no longer giving them all the answers. And that uncertainty, when it's not extreme or manipulative, actually pulls them closer. Because now, instead of you trying to understand them, they're trying to understand you. But there's a difference between this kind of detachment and something that often gets confused with it. Because a lot of people hear this and think it means becoming distant, cold, or hard to reach. They try to act like they don't care. They force themselves to hold back, to delay responses, to create artificial distance in the hope that it will trigger a reaction. But that kind of behavior doesn't create real change. It creates tension, but not the kind that leads to connection. Because it's not coming from a genuine place. And avoidants, even if they struggle with closeness, are incredibly sensitive to emotional authenticity. They can feel when something is forced, they can feel when the energy is off, and when detachment is used as a strategy instead of a natural state, it doesn't create attraction, it creates confusion. Real detachment is different. It's not something you perform. It's something you become. It's the result of no longer tying your emotional stability to their behavior. It's the quiet understanding that your value doesn't depend on how consistently they show up. And when that shift happens internally, your external behavior changes without effort. You don't need to remind yourself to hold back. You don't need to calculate your responses. You simply exist in a way that reflects your own sense of self, not the fluctuations of the connection. And that's what creates a turning point. Because now the roles that once defined the dynamic begin to blur. The one who used to chase no longer chases. The one who used to pull away starts to lean in. Not in a perfect immediate way, but in a noticeable one. They begin initiating more, they begin staying present longer, they begin showing a level of effort that wasn't there before. And it might feel subtle at first, but if you pay attention, you can see it clearly. They're trying. Not because they've suddenly become a completely different person, but because the connection now requires something from them that it didn't before. Consistency, presence, choice. And that's what changes everything. Because before, the connection existed regardless of their level of effort. It was maintained by your consistency, your patience, your willingness to stay even when things felt uncertain. But now the connection reflects what they bring into it. And if they don't show up, they feel the distance in a way they never had to before. And this is where the deeper realization starts to settle in for them. That they can't just leave and come back to the same place anymore. That something has shifted in a way that requires them to engage differently if they want to keep you in their life. And for someone who is used to having space without consequence, that realization can be both unfamiliar and deeply impactful. Because now, for the first time, staying connected isn't automatic. It's intentional. And whether they fully understand it or not, they begin to feel that if they don't step forward, they might actually lose something that once felt guaranteed. And when that realization finally settles in, when they begin to feel that staying connected to you is no longer something automatic, something quietly irreversible happens inside them. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It doesn't come with some sudden confession or perfectly timed clarity. It shows up in subtleties, in the way they linger a little longer in conversations, in the way they start thinking twice before pulling away, in the way their actions begin to carry a weight that wasn't there before. Because now, for the first time, they're not just experiencing you, they're experiencing the possibility of losing you. And that's something they're not used to. Before, distance was easy. It was familiar. It was their way of managing emotions that felt too intense. And every time they took that space, the connection remained intact in the background. It didn't challenge them. It didn't force them to confront anything. It simply waited. But now, it doesn't feel like it's waiting in the same way. Now, when they step back, there's a question that lingers in their mind, one that wasn't there before. What if this time it's different? And that question changes how they move. Because people don't value what's always guaranteed in the same way they value something that requires presence, something that requires effort, something that can actually be lost. And this is where everything comes full circle. Because the entire time it looked like they were the ones in control. It looked like they were the ones deciding when to stay, when to go, when to come back. But in reality, the dynamic was shaped by something much deeper than their actions alone. It was shaped by what the connection allowed. And now, the connection no longer allows the same patterns to exist without consequence. You're no longer the constant that absorbs inconsistency. You're no longer the one holding everything together no matter what. You've stepped into a space where your presence has value, not because you demanded it, but because you stopped giving it away so freely. And that's the part most people misunderstand. Because from the outside, it might look like control. It might look like you've figured out a way to make them stay, to make them come back, to make them invest. But that's not what this is. You didn't control them. You changed yourself. And in doing that, you changed the dynamic. You stopped reacting from fear. You stopped chasing reassurance. You stopped trying to prove your worth through effort. And instead, you started showing up in a way that reflected something deeper, something more grounded, something that didn't depend on whether they stayed or left. And that's what shifted everything. Because when someone can no longer rely on your presence being unconditional to their inconsistency, they're forced into a position where they have to choose, not casually, not passively, but consciously. They have to decide if they're willing to meet you where you are, or risk losing you altogether. And that's the moment where the idea of they can't leave without your permission reveals its true meaning. It was never about stopping them physically. It was never about manipulating their emotions or making them feel trapped. It was about the emotional environment that existed between you. Before, leaving didn't feel like a real ending, because your energy kept the door open no matter what. Now leaving feels different, because that door is no longer held open by default. If they walk away, they feel the distance. If they go silent, they feel the absence. If they choose not to show up, they experience what it means to actually lose connection. And that's something that can't be ignored. Because even for someone who struggles with closeness, connection still matters. They may not express it the same way. They may not always understand it within themselves, but when something real is no longer easily accessible, it creates a kind of clarity that wasn't there before. And that clarity forces a decision. Some will step forward. They'll begin to show up in ways that feel more consistent, more intentional, more aligned with what you've been offering all along. Not perfectly, not without moments of hesitation, but with a genuine shift in effort. Others won't. And that's the part that's hard to accept. Because when you stop holding the connection together on your own, you also allow it to reveal what it truly is. Not what you hoped it could be. Not what it almost felt like at its best. But what it consistently shows itself to be when both people are responsible for it. And that truth can feel heavy. But it's also freeing, because for the first time you're no longer stuck in a cycle that keeps repeating itself without resolution. You're no longer waiting for someone to become something they haven't chosen to be. You're standing in a place where your energy is no longer tied to their inconsistency. And from that place, everything becomes clearer. Because whether they stay or leave, it's no longer happening in a dynamic where you lose yourself trying to keep them. It's happening in a space where you've already found yourself again. And that's the real power in all of this. Not the ability to make someone stay, but the ability to no longer need them to stay in order to feel whole. Because when you reach that point, something shifts in a way that no external action can replicate. You stop fearing distance. You stop fearing silence. You stop fearing the possibility of them walking away. Because you understand something now that you didn't before. That your value isn't defined by who stays. It's reflected in how you allow yourself to be treated And when that becomes your foundation, you don't have to control anything. You don't have to convince anyone. You don't have to chase or hold on or prove your worth. You simply exist in a way that naturally filters what belongs in your life and what doesn't. And the right kind of connection, the kind that meets you with the same level of presence, the same level of intention, the same level of respect, that connection doesn't need to be forced. It doesn't need to be managed. It doesn't need to be held together by one person. It meets you where you are because it wants to stay. And everything else falls away on its own. So if you've been feeling like they had all the power, like they were the one deciding everything, like you were just reacting to their choices, look again. Because the moment you stopped giving away your energy in a way that made leaving easy, you changed the entire dynamic. They were never as in control as it seemed. You just hadn't fully stepped into your own yet. And now that you have, everything feels different. Not because they changed first, but because you finally did.